Locking the front door at night provides an essential psychological comfort. The home acts as a physical barrier, an agreed-upon sanctuary that separates us from the unpredictability of the outside world. This diagram illustrates why high-rise apartments feel uniquely secure. Elevating a living space to the 8th floor removes ground-level vulnerabilities. Combined with a locked door, the probability of an external physical threat drops to nearly zero. It is essentially a mathematically secure box. At 3:17 a.m., Marcus Reed woke to a sound that violated this logic. It was the soft, rhythmic drumming of fingers against his bedroom window, skin hitting glass from the outside. There were no trees near the building, and no balconies attached to his unit. Basic physics dictated that the window should be unreachable. The moment that sound occurred, the architectural security of the high-rise effectively collapsed. Marcus was not the first resident to report this impossible noise point 24 hours earlier. His downstairs neighbor in apartment 806 experienced the same thing. Elena Vasquez, a 32-year-old with no history of mental illness, spent her final minutes calling 911. She told dispatchers an entity was smiling at her from the window before she voluntarily threw herself to the pavement below. Now, Marcus sat upright in the dark, staring at his curtains as the same rhythmic tapping echoed through his own bedroom. This sequence of events points to a specific psychological trap. We have to examine why a rational person, when confronted with an impossible noise outside, would conclude that jumping 8 stories is the only viable escape. The entity operates by weaponizing curiosity. It creates an anomaly strange enough to bypass a victim's survival instincts, drawing them toward the physical barrier of the window to identify the source of the noise. When Marcus pulled back the curtain, the city below was empty, but the glass told a different story. Large, smeared handprints were pressed against the outside of the window, looking as though left by wet skin. An unknown caller then confirmed his worst fear that IT knows you can see it now. Marcus looked up to see a pale figure hanging upside down, its face pressed to the glass, featuring a mouth stretched unnaturally wide in a static smile. The act of looking functions as a trigger. It marks the moment the entity breaches the first perimeter of the home, shifting from an external curiosity to a direct acknowledged threat. Faced with an impossible intruder, Marcus attempted to retreat into the safety of the public hallway, seeking the communal protection of his neighbors. He opened his door to find the hallway already full. Every resident of the 8th floor stood perfectly still, their eyes entirely black. They spoke in unison, acknowledging that he had finally looked outside. The entity systematically neutralizes social safety nets. By corrupting the surrounding community, it ensures the victim is isolated, turning the hallway into a barricade rather than an exit. Marcus retreated and locked his door. The perimeter of safety had now tightened from the entire building down to the interior walls of his own apartment. As shown here, the threat transitioned into the physical structure of the unit. The tapping sound moved through the walls toward the kitchen. The entity dismantled his psychological safety by mimicking his voice, perfectly converging on his position. A shadow stretched across the floor, and a creature with Marcus's face stepped into view. Its limbs were too long, its jaw unhinged with a wet crack, and its mouth was a void of complete darkness without or throat. The mimic explained that Elena, the woman from 806, didn't jump to get away from what was on the outside of a window. This mimicry serves to paralyze the victim. By presenting a distorted version of the self, the entity locks the target in place, setting the stage for the final spatial reversal. The entities tapping at the glass and scratching through the walls have no interest in entering the apartment. Every window rattled. Dozens of smiling figures stood outside in the rain, pointing toward the shattered bedroom glass. They were waiting for him. Looking outside seals the victim's fate because it forces a realization. The primary monster is already inside, blocking the only door to the hallway. This spatial inversion triggers the flight response. With the hallway blocked by a nightmare and the bedroom door open to a drop, the victim perceives the 8th floor window not as a hazard, but as the only remaining exit. The 3:17 a.m. entity targets the primary assumption of home safety. It creates a lasting paranoia about the reliability of locked doors. We view these barriers as our protection, trusting them to keep the unknown at a distance. However, the physical barriers of a fortress are designed to exclude, but they also function as walls of a cage. The same locks that keep the world out ensure that if a threat does breach the perimeter, the victim remains trapped inside with it. If you ever hear a tap on your window in the dead of night, the real terror begins when you finally turn away from the glass to see what has been waiting in the room behind. Over the past month, a specific pattern of disappearances has entered the town of Ashwood Creek. The victims share no obvious demographic links. A teenage boy, an elderly woman, and an entire family have all vanished without a trace. Local police suspect a string of targeted kidnappings, while internet forums debate the presence of a local cult. But residents living near the dense woods surrounding the town suspect the forest itself is reclaiming the suburbs. This map plots the location of every recent disappearance in Ashwood Creek. The data points reveal a spatial anomaly. The vanishings are radiating outward from the deep woods, directly into the surrounding suburban grids. In a neighborhood defined by uncertainty, a locked suburban front door at 3 a.m. represents the final line of defense. It is the boundary between the unpredictable outside world and a resident's physical safety. Any predator facing this boundary must solve a basic operational problem. To reach its prey, it must either use enough physical force to break the barrier, or convince the prey to unlock it voluntarily. The Ashwood Creek entity overcomes this obstacle by bypassing physical security altogether, accessing its victims by hijacking their psychological defenses. Daniel Harper woke at 3:03 a.m. to 3 deliberate knocks. Outside, a heavy rainstorm battered his home, yet the knocking remained steady and calm. Daniel Harper immediately recognized the logical disconnect. Nobody visits at 3 in the morning, especially not in a town defined by unexplained disappearances. Then a voice spoke through the door, calling him Danny. Only one person ever used that nickname, his mother, who had died 2 years earlier. This contact is a highly targeted lure. The entity tests the victim's emotional history to find the exact tone that will draw them toward the door. The creature relies on exact auditory mimicry. It replicates the shaky tone, specific phrasing, and gentle cadence of Carol Harper's voice with terrifying precision. Daniel never got to say goodbye to his mother before she died of a stroke. The entity selected this specific unresolved guilt as its entry point. This diagram illustrates a process called cognitive override. In high-stress scenarios, an extreme emotional stimulus, like intense grief, can forcibly bypass the brain's standard threat detection pathways. The 3 a.m. timing exacerbates this effect. The brain is caught in sleep inertia, a state where emotional reactions easily overwhelm rational deduction. The entity offers Daniel a false opportunity for closure, using the weight of his own regret to guide his hand toward the lock. As the voice outside bid for warmth, the physical reality of the situation began to surface. A flash of lightning revealed a puddle of wet footprints waiting beneath the door, belonging to a shape that did not match the voice. Looking at the shadow, Daniel realized the shape had too many legs that a survival instinct warned him touching the lock would be a fatal error. Sensing this hesitation, the entity rapidly escalated its tactics. It began slamming against the wood, faking a panic attack and screaming in terror. A second voice then joined the fray, a low, unnatural male voice echoing in the rain, creating a manufactured crisis on Daniel's porch. Hearing his mother scream in agonizing pain triggered Daniel's protective instinct. Logic vanished as he rushed forward to open the door and save the person he thought was outside. When passive manipulation fails to break a target, the predator uses manufactured urgency to turn a human's best instincts into a self-destructive mechanism. Before Daniel could turn the lock, a call from an unknown number interrupted him. An old man whispered a warning. The entity returns every few years, hunting exclusively with voices the victims trust. In this structural layout, the front door acts as an impenetrable exterior boundary. The caller explained that the creature requires permission to cross this threshold. If the door remains closed, the interior is safe. But as the power went out, Daniel heard wet footsteps moving through his kitchen. Despite the locked front door, the creature was already inside. The attack at the door was a distraction. Daniel had kept his mother's bedroom exactly as it was the day she died, treating it as a static monument. By preserving this space for a person the entity had already mimicked, he unknowingly left an interior portion of his home claimed by the predator. The preservation of a physical space for the dead created a literal, unbarricaded foothold for the entity to manifest within the home's perimeter. The creature finally revealed itself at the top of the stairs. A tall, thin silhouette with its head tilted sideways and skin stretched unnaturally tight over an eyeless skull. As it sprinted toward Daniel, it began laughing. The sound was a cacophony of dozens of stolen voices. Children, old men, and his mother. The Ashwood Creek entity is an amalgamation of its past victims, collecting their voices to expand its arsenal of use. This predator functions as a parasite, feeding on the emotional tethers that connect the living to the dead. While the creature possesses incredible speed and claws, its most effective tool for hunting is its understanding of the human heart. It succeeds because it recognizes that a person's emotional history is more fragile than their physical environment. Love and grief provide the access points this predator requires. It relies on the fact that a human being will often prioritize an emotional connection over a physical barrier.